Hello and welcome to Solipsis. I'm Khashayar Mohammadi, aka Kramer, and Solipsis is a low source for film criticism, ephemera, and ekphrasis. I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of films that challenge me, that make me uncomfortable, that teach me something new. The first film I'm going to talk about is Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It initially released in 2019, it was a contender at Cannes, and then it had its wide release in 2020. I think it's out digitally now on Google Play and YouTube Films. So right off the bat, I didn't like the film when I first watched it. As it is the case with a bunch of my favorite films from the last few years, the films that challenge me the most are films that I do not like the first time I watch them, but they do not leave my mind after watching them. I watched Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I gotta admit, I did not like it. I did not know what it was trying to tell me, but it did not leave my mind. It haunted me day and night, begging me to go back and watch it again, and I'm glad that I did. I watched it a second time, it still did not leave me until I had to go back and buy it this time. So I'm gonna give a brief overview of the film before getting into the nitty-gritty, which is that the film is written and directed by Celine Sciamma. It stars three wonderful actors: Noemie Merlant as the painter, Adele Haenel as Eloise, and Luana Bajrami as Sophie. It's about a portrait. Eloise is getting married off, and the painter is hired to paint a portrait of Eloise without her knowing about it. The majority of the first act is about the painting of the portrait until Marianne, or the painter, decides to reveal to Eloise she is in fact a commissioned painter. A little while after, there is a kiss by Eloise that makes us realize that there was some desire beneath all this companionship. And a second portrait is painted. A wonderful, wonderful ending. The film has no music. There is only the ambient sound of waves and very brief scenes where music is played diegetically inside the film. The film really tries to concentrate on the silence of painting. There is no lines by men in the film. There is one line by a man in the first 5 minutes, and there are 3 or 4 lines by another man in the last 10 minutes of the film. The rest of the film revolves around the 3 women of the film. The painter, Eloise, who is being painted, and Eloise's maid, Sophie. The painter, the subject of the painting, and the maid. The film has perhaps one of my all-time favorite character introductions. Eloise's character introduction is phenomenal. We don't see her, we approach her from behind. At that point where we meet Eloise in the film, all we know about her is that her sister has committed suicide by jumping off a cliff. We follow Eloise from behind. We don't see her face. We haven't seen her yet. We walk with her to the shore and we watch her run for the cliff. And at the beautiful moment, she just turns around. We see her face and she says, "I've been dreaming that for years." Marianne says, "Of dying?" And she says, "No, of running." So the first hour is spent in these daily walks that Marianne and Eloise go on. In these little walks and in these little daily trips, Marianne is spending most of her time looking at Eloise intently in order to kind of etch a little portrait of her in her mind and go back to her canvas at the end of the day and paint whatever she remembers. It's here that the film kind of sets up its philosophy of representation. This is where the film sets up what this portrait means and how it's an incubation of an unwanted marriage. And also here begins the mechanics of the gaze. The gaze begins as a tool for the production of art. Then the gaze becomes an end in itself. The object becomes a subject. Here's when Celine Sciamma basically starts dissecting representation of women in art, and it's here that the role of Sophie becomes important as well. She becomes a link between Eloise and Marianne. And there is this beautiful equality between the mistress, the painter, and the maid. There is very little power play. They're peers, they're very equal. Also, like I mentioned before, there is very little to no music throughout the film, but the music that is heard is crucial to the plot. For example, in the first act, Eloise tells Marianne that she enjoys going to mass to hear music. And here the film starts showing the difference between Marianne and Eloise, between dependence and independence. Marianne is very well versed in art, she has traveled, Eloise has been just basically waiting for marriage. And Eloise has very little artistic education. So Marianne tries to play the intro to Vivaldi's Summer on the harpsichord.
Ça raconte l'histoire d'un orage qui monte. Et des insectes qui le sentent. Et s'agite. Et la tempête qui éclate.
It's the first scene where we see the two truly connecting. Marianne is trying to convey her experience in life, her independence, to Eloise through music. At the end of the first act, the first portrait has been completed. The portrait that Marianne painted behind Eloise's back. When Marianne's commission is finished, she insists to show Eloise the portrait herself. It's interesting to point out that when Marianne tells Eloise that she has painted a portrait of her, this scene is the first scene where Eloise is mentioned by name, and perhaps, I think, the only scene, while Marianne remains unnamed throughout the entire film. Here is where the film gets incredibly interesting. Eloise sees her portrait but does not see herself in the portrait. She sees a portrait that represents her physically but has nothing of her character inside. This is where Celine Sciamma starts to make her statement about how women throughout the ages have been represented physically because they were beautiful, because they had a certain power, but never because of who they were, and never fully and properly represented or given due credit for the art that they had a part in creating. The painting is crude. Eloise calls it conventional. Eloise does not like it. Here's perhaps one of the most contemplative scenes in the entire film. Eloise cannot see her presence in the art, and this is where Marianne starts to defend her art.
Pas de présence. C'est fait d'état passager, d'aspect momentané, cela peut aussi manquer de vérité.
So basically Marianne is starting to dictate Eloise's personality. And this is again another parallel to artists throughout the ages who have represented women. Eloise is not having it. She demands to have a say in her own portrait.
Vraiment? Oui.
Eloise does not want a fleeting glimpse of herself. She wants herself. So she wants to consent to her own portrait, so she decides to pose for Marianne. Another beautiful scene that we get to see after this is the card game. And a card game has always been a great tool in cinema for portraying character. The film has phenomenal eye choreography. It reminds me a lot of Barry Lyndon's Card Game, where the eyes are so expertly choreographed to tell a certain story without any words being said.
Patron. Faites le jeu. Rien de plus. Fils, gagne. Faites le jeu.
Ça y est, c'est bon. Vous avez touché. Concentrez-vous. À vous. Vous trichez?
Mais non, je ne triche pas. Je joue vite.
And then we get to the main lore of the film. There is a scene where Sophie, Marianne, and Eloise read Orpheus together.
Après avoir préludé en frappant les cordes de sa lyre, il chanta ainsi.
So Sophie is mad at Orpheus for turning around and looking at Eurydice.
C'est horrible. La pauvre, pourquoi s'est-il retourné? On lui a dit de ne pas se retourner et au dernier moment, il se retourne sans raison.
Il y a des raisons.
and by doing this, losing his beloved forever. But Marianne is defending Orpheus.
Peut-être que s'il se retourne, c'est qu'il fait un choix.
Quel choix?
Il choisit le souvenir d'Eurydice. C'est pour ça qu'il se retourne.
Marianne is saying that Orpheus prefers the memory of Eurydice to her. Here, Eloise is neutral. Eloise is simply reading.
Il n'était pas loin d'atteindre la surface de la terre. Il touchait au bord lorsque, craignant qu'Eurydice ne lui échappe et impatient de la voir, son amoureux époux tourne les yeux.
Another part of the main lore of the film is the word that Orpheus hears before turning around, which is
Retourne-toi.
I have to admit, one of the main places in the film that I had a big time comprehending was the festival scene. In fact, I'm only calling it a festival scene because that's how it's called on the web. I did not know it was a festival. I did not know what relation it had to the entire film. I just know that at some point in the film, the three characters just go into the woods surrounded by these women who are chanting by the fire. The women are singing in Latin, and that chant is non possum fuggere, which means they cannot escape. And here's where Eloise's garment catches on fire. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the film because we see this scene from Marianne's point of view. Marianne is looking at Eloise with her garment on fire, completely oblivious to the fire that is consuming her. But we know from the portrait that we see in the beginning of the film, this moment is the moment that Marianne chooses as her memory of Eloise.
Peut-être que s'il se retourne, c'est qu'il fait un choix.
Quel choix?
Il choisit le souvenir d'Eurydice.
In Marianne's mind, Eloise is represented as this woman, oblivious to the fire that is consuming her. So another part of the film that I think is very beautiful, but I had trouble getting into, was Sophie's pregnancy. So at some point in the film, we realize that Sophie is pregnant, and Marianne and Eloise try to help her throughout several scenes to abort her child. There are beautiful scenes, but I personally think they did not fit the plot as well as the rest of the movie. I enjoyed the scenes, they were beautiful, they represented something truly unique, but in terms of narrative, they kind of unhinged me and threw me off. So now we get to the second act of the film, which starts with a kiss. Eloise kisses Marianne, affirming the desire that has been bubbling underneath. And after this, Marianne begins to see apparition of Eloise. This apparition is seen twice throughout the film before it's explained what it means. So the kiss leads us into the second portrait, and the second portrait is a lot more human. It's a lot more collaborative. And when I was reading about the film, I realized that Celine Sciamma has said quite intently that she was trying to challenge the idea of woman as muse. So this becomes a collaboration as opposed to a painter painting an object. This is a pure subject that contributes. But as the second portrait is painted, Marianne still wants to destroy it because now it represents the giving away of her beloved to a man. Another thing that is very interesting about the portrait is Eloise asked Marianne, at what point do we stop painting? Marianne says, the painting never finishes. At one point we stop. And that again continues that whole concept of the fleeting personalities trapped in art. That there is never a self cemented in a portrait. There is only glimpses that are piled on and on as the culmination of selves that it has created. The film has some of the absolute most beautiful queer love scenes. I am not gonna get into them because I think this is the only part of the film that you need to see as opposed to hear criticized. I have no criticism for the queer love scenes. They are absolutely beautiful and magnificent. I'm not gonna spoil them. You better go and watch it. But as the second portrait finishes, it marks Marianne's time for departure. So here's when the main lore of Orpheus returns. So when it's time for Marianne to leave, she is leaving the house and walking out the door until she hears the words "Retourne-toi."
Retourne-toi.
Turn around, like we hear in the story of Orpheus. So I think one small part that might be lost to the people who do not speak French is the fact that Marianne and Héloïse throughout the film have been talking to each other with the formal form vous. So not only is the Retourne-toi reference to Orpheus' story, but it is also represents a newfound intimacy. We see all this formality between Marianne and Héloïse was performative, and we are assured of the love that these two have for another just with a single word. Here is where Marianne turns around to look at Héloïse one last time. She is wearing a bright white outfit. She is lit by a glowing shaft of morning light. This image is the exact image that Marianne has been seeing in her apparitions of Héloïse. And this is again another reference to Orpheus and Eurydice. The ending of the film is magnificent, but here is also another time that I have a major complaint. When it becomes apparent that Marianne is about to leave, Marianne wants to give Héloïse a parting gift, and this parting gift is a self-portrait that Marianne paints of herself naked in a mirror nestled between Héloïse's thighs. This portrait is painted on page 28 of a book that Héloïse gives to Marianne and is later returned as a gift. I feel the ending is too perfect ending. I feel either one of the two would have made an absolutely brilliant ending, but watching them back to back feels like watching the alternative endings. It's years later, we see Marianne in an art show where she finds a portrait of Héloïse with a child. However, in this portrait, Héloïse is holding a book. The book is held open on page 28. This would have made an absolutely perfect ending. It shows that after all this while, Héloïse is still deeply in love with Marianne. However, the film does not end here. We move on to a music hall. Vivaldi's Summer is being played. And as we remember, Vivaldi's Summer is the piece that Marianne played on the harpsichord for Héloïse. The film ends with Marianne's gaze being fixed on Héloïse as she gets increasingly emotional. We again realize that she has held on to all this love and all this desire all these years. So overall, it's a beautiful film. I love how it challenges French cinema as a whole and its prevalent pretty girl and a gun misogynist love stories. In fact, it reminds me more of a Persian love story than anything else. It reminds me of myself as a teenager growing up queer on the streets of Tehran and seeing all these implicit glance economies that can only thrive under oppression. It reminds me of all the ancient Persian love stories that I grew up on, where all these incredibly complicated things were said with a single glance or a single gesture. It's an absolute triumph of queer cinema. I'm gonna go back and watch everything by Celine Sciamma again. And another thing is that it's perhaps one of the most widely successful queer films recently. I highly recommend it, and I recommend to each and every one of you to give it another chance if you didn't like it the first time you watched it. So, thank you so much for watching Solipsist. I've been Khashayar Mohammadi. I'll see you soon with another video. Have a good one.